Oh, good day, everyone. Welcome to Hashem is Beautiful, where we discuss Torah and different Jewish concepts. I recently had a discussion with a Christian. Did Jesus violate the Sabbath? Let's look into that question. When you discuss with Christians, this topic with Christians, what they will often tell you is that, look, Jesus understood the law correctly. The rabbis did not. Now, if you are a Christian, you know that that's what you believe because that is what is often responded to Jews. Jesus understood the law correctly, and the rabbis did not. And therefore, when they said certain things to Jesus regarding things he was doing wrong, they always side with Jesus. They're always going to side with Jesus because they believe, Jesus being God and having that authority, that what he said is what counts as truth, is what is truth. So therefore, whatever interpretations, quote unquote, that the rabbis had about the Torah were incorrect interpretations. So therefore, whatever they corrected or attempted to tell Jesus that he was doing something wrong, his understanding of the Torah was obviously the correct one, and therefore they were wrong. Okay, so now let's apply this for a moment. Let's walk through an example of this and talk it out and see how we can apply that idea. Okay, so there's an account in the book of Matthew and Mark where Jesus and his disciples are walking in the field on Sabbath, on Shabbos, and his disciples, his students, not him, his students are picking grain on the Sabbath. They're picking grain. They're doing essentially what we call in Judaism a melacha. Now, what's a melacha? A melacha is a prohibited action, something that you may not do on the Sabbath. There are 39 of them. Okay, we won't get into what the source of those 39 is, but for now we'll just say that there are 39 prohibited actions that Jews may not do on the Sabbath. So in the story, in Matthew and Mark, the rabbis come to Jesus and his disciples in the field and they say, what you are doing is unlawful on the Sabbath, meaning they're telling him, you're breaking Shabbos. You're breaking Shabbos. You're not allowed to pick grain on the Sabbath. Now, before we even get into that for a second, let's quickly hash this out. Let's focus our attention momentarily to the book of Nehemiah. He's a prophet. There is an account which I'm going to paraphrase in Nehemiah. It's in chapter 13, verses 15 to 22. Basically, what happens is this. He sets this up. Shabbos is about to come. It's right before evening. Sundown is about to happen, which is when Sabbath starts. Shabbat starts, sundown, Shkia. And what happens is that there are a bunch of Jews standing out there in the gate of Jerusalem, and they're meeting with these Gentiles, and they're partaking in all kinds of trade and prohibited actions. They're loading things onto their animals, they're unloading things, they're buying and they're selling, they're handling money. They're doing all kinds of things. Okay. Now the prophet Nehemiah comes up to them, and he has some harsh words for them. He says to them, look, you are breaking Shabbos. You're breaking the Sabbath, and it's not Sabbath yet. It's about to be Sabbath. So they're doing things that they're not supposed to right before Shabbos comes in, and therefore they will be doing those things on Shabbos, on the Sabbath. So he tells them you can't do that. Now here's the interesting thing. Okay, here's the real question. The prophet Nehemiah is obviously treating the things that they're doing as biblical prohibitions. So let's go over them. Look up the verses yourself, but if I recall correctly, they're buying and they're selling, so they're handling money, and they're loading things onto their animals and unloading things, which are also biblical prohibitions. Okay? Now he treats those things like they were biblical prohibitions. He says, you can't do these things. You're not allowed to do these things. So now here's a question. If Nehemiah says, if he treats them as biblical prohibitions, but the Torah itself doesn't say anywhere that you can't do those things. And it doesn't. Because when the Torah, just as a quick background, when the Torah gives the prohibitions on the Sabbath, the only explicit one that it mentions, the only one it mentions explicitly is the prohibition of lighting a fire. That's the only one. So, but there are 38 other prohibitions that are not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. So then, first of all, where do we get those? That's a question. Put that in the back burner for a second. But obviously, whether or not the Torah says them, Nehemiah, the prophet, is treating them as if the Torah said you can't do those things. He's treating them as biblical prohibitions. So now here's the question. Are they biblical prohibitions, or are they rabbinic inventions? Meaning, is Nehemiah believing that the rabbi said you cannot do, but which the Torah doesn't say you cannot do? Meaning, is he believing in things that the rabbis added prohibitions that the rabbis added to the Sabbath when the Torah does not say that you can't do those things? So that's the question. So the answer, of course, is that we possess something called the oral law, the Oral Torah. And the Oral Torah is an authentic log of the explanation of the commandments and of injunctions that are not explicitly written out in the Torah. So, for example, where do we get the idea that we have 39 biblical prohibitions on the Sabbath when the Torah only lists one of them? Where do we get the idea that there are 39? Obviously, we have the Oral Torah. Now, this is beyond the scope of what I'm trying to say here, but there are actually biblical proofs, biblical verses, actual biblical references to the Oral Torah, which I'll describe in a different video. It's beyond the scope of this video, but the point is that we understand that the Oral Torah is an explanation of the written Torah, so we understand that it's legitimate. And in addition, if that's not enough for you, there are a couple of actual explicit references to the Oral Torah, which, as I said, I'll describe in a different video. So here's the point. Now let's put this back into context. Let's go back to the story of Jesus in the field on Sabbath with his students, the disciples. They were violating one of these 39 actions, melachas. They were violating the action of the biblical prohibition of harvesting. Okay, picking grain. It doesn't matter how hard or easy it is. This is fundamental in Jewish law in halacha, in the melachas of Shabbos. It doesn't matter how hard or easy it is to do. It can be very easy to violate Shabbos. You just pick grain. You're violating Shabbos. It doesn't have to be something hard. So the word is often translated as work. And that's not the correct word, because work is avoda. Avoda means work. The word is melacha. Melacha is a category of action. Okay, it means labor. Okay, when you hear the word labor, you think in your mind something which is strenuous, but that's not necessarily the case. Something that's a melacha can be something that's very easy. Like you can pick up an apple and leave your house. That's a melacha. Picking grain is a melacha. So here's a question. So when Nehemiah told these Jews that were doing these things right before the Sabbath, and they're by definition, by extension, on the Sabbath, was that a rabbinic interpretation? Or was that a biblical injunction not to do those things? Okay, so let that question sit with you and you think about it on your own. In addition, the story of Jesus in the field on the Sabbath, when I first read that, I immediately thought of a story in the Torah, which seems like a clear corollary, which is when the Jews were in the desert, the 40 years in the desert, and Hashem, God was providing them with manna, with a man, which came down from the heavens. Now he said, every day go out, collect manna, and you'll have enough for the whole day until the next day. But on Friday, and Erev Shabbos, right, you were not allowed to pick on the Sabbath. You can't go out into the field and take man on Shabbos. So I'll provide for you a double portion on evening before Sabbath. Take a double portion, and it'll last the entire Sabbath. And then what happens is you got these couple of stinkers. You got these Jews who walked out and they were wandering in the fields on the Shabbos, and they were picking manna. They were collecting manna. And Moshe Rabbeinu comes to them, Moses, and he had harsh words for them. I'm not going to read you the verses now, but he had harsh words for them. You want to see what he says? It's in Exodus chapter 15, verses 23 through 30. Okay, so when I first read this account of Jesus and his disciples on the field on the Sabbath picking grain, by the way, Jesus wasn't picking grain; his students were. We'll get to that in a second. I think it's instrumental to the story. They were picking grain on the Sabbath, and the rabbis, right, the Pharisees, who are the rabbis, come to start a fight. Okay, they come to pick a fight with him. They say, what you're doing is unlawful on the Sabbath. And he responds to them. I won't go into it here. You, if you're a Christian, you know the story very well. He responds to them. Basically, he tells them, look, your interpretation of the Torah, specifically in this context of the injunction of labor on the Sabbath, is wrong. He says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, right? He says to them, I understand what the Torah really means when it says not to pick grain on the Sabbath, and you don't. And by the way, it's interesting that his response is quite interesting. If you read this response, you'll see that it's quite interesting. tells the rabbis that when King David was starving in the temple, they ate the showbread, meaning they did something they were not supposed to do. Okay, this, I think what he's trying to say here is that if you're starving, you may break halacha. Now, that's interesting that he says that, because that is the Jewish law. That is the halacha, is that if you are starving, if you're going to die, there's something called pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh means that you not only may, but you have to violate the Sabbath to survive. So if there are life-threatening situations that occur on the Sabbath, you don't say, no, I'm going to keep the Sabbath and die. No, you break the Sabbath so that you can live. So it seems to be that that's what he's saying to them. But if that's the case, then there's something very odd here, which we have to think about, is that, are they starving to death? Are his disciples starving to death such that they have to pick grain, violate the Sabbath to survive? I don't know what it was like in the first century Judaism in Israel, but today, the way Orthodox Jews, and if you want to call them Orthodox Jews, and you can, the way Orthodox Jews, what we do on Sabbath, on Shabbos, is that we eat meals. We eat 3 meals a day on Sabbath, and often those meals are festive. We eat them with family, the communal, or with friends. So everyone's eating meals on the Sabbath. Now, if you go into a neighborhood, into a Jewish neighborhood, a religious one, and you have nowhere to go, most likely you can knock on someone's door, even if you don't know them, and you say, I have nowhere to eat, they'll let you in. They don't have to know you. They understand. It may be awkward, okay, but they understand. Here's a guy. He's stuck without a meal on Shabbos. They'll let you in, and you'll eat with them. So here's a question. We're going to apply that reality to First Temple Judaism, okay? The Pharisees, Jesus and his students are walking around in the field. They have nothing to eat. Can't they go to someone's house? Are they not Orthodox Jews? Can't they go to someone's house and just knock on the door and say, we're starving. Can we have a meal with you? And most likely people would say, yeah, come in, have a meal, sit down. You want a bench? You want to wash? You want a kiddush? They'll invite you in. So to go to the most extreme conclusion, which is that they had to break the Shabbos in order to survive, yeah, that's true. That's true as a last-ditch effort. If you can eat without breaking the Shabbos, then you do that. Okay, so that's one thing. But there's another thing that I noticed when I read the story, which is I think Christians may not recognize because they're not as familiar with Oral Torah as Jews are, or even just Jewish law. The halacha says that when a person is committing a capital offense, and breaking the Sabbath is a capital offense, you don't just take him out and kill him once he does it. There's a whole procedure, there's a whole legal procession that has to occur before a person can be liable for the death penalty. And that is, first, he needs 2 witnesses who are valid witnesses to come to him and to say, listen, buddy, what you're doing is breaking Shabbos. They have to warn him twice. And each time he has to say, I don't care, get lost, I know what I'm doing is not allowed, and I'm going to do it anyway. Only then is he liable for the death penalty. Only then is he liable for it. That doesn't mean that you go and you kill him the second he's liable. He has to go to a court, a beis din, and they have to examine the whole series of events, and he has to come out guilty. They have to find him guilty before they put him to death. There isn't mob rule. There isn't just this like spontaneous, you take a person and put him in, throw him into a field and then just stone him to death. That's just not how it works. That's not how it works. Interestingly, the Christian scriptures make it look that way. But that's not how it happened. That's not how it worked at all. And we also know that the actual death penalty was quite a rare thing in practice in Jewish law, meaning it was prescribed for certain things, but the amount that it actually occurred was not very common. So it's unlikely that people just were being killed left and right for breaking things, okay, for breaking rules. It probably wasn't. It didn't work that way. What's also interesting is that you need, as I said, the people have to warn the violator twice. How many times did the Pharisees warn Jesus in this story in Matthew and Mark, how many times did they warn him? They warned him once. Now, you could just say, okay, it's incidental. You can say the story is made up. But let's say the story really occurred this way. Let's say this is, take it at face value. It happened this way. So if you're going to read into it, they don't really want him dead, right? Because they're not warning him. They don't warn him twice. They warn him once, meaning they essentially leave him alone. They tell him one time, listen, you're not allowed to do this, okay? Please, think clearly about what you're doing here. You're not allowed to. You're breaking Shabbos. But they only warn him one time, meaning, legally speaking, he's not liable for the death penalty at this point because they only warn him one time. So, to me, if the story really occurred, and it occurred this way, it seems to me that they're not after him. They're not trying to get him killed. They don't have an interest in getting him killed. They have an interest in engaging him and perhaps seeing what his response would be. Okay? They're trying to reach out to him, trying to connect to him in some kind of way. But they don't want him to die. Otherwise, they would just say twice, you can't, you're breaking the Sabbath, and they would be liable for the death penalty. That's something that passes under the Christian radar because they don't know this. And the final point I wanted to make before ending is that what I began to mention earlier, which is that in the story, Jesus and his disciples are in the field on the Sabbath, and who's picking the grain? It's not Jesus. Jesus is not picking the grain. His disciples are picking the grain. Okay, so that is interesting, because what you have is a situation here where his disciples are violating the Sabbath, and he is not. Okay, so now let's back this up and imagine for a second how the day would have started. Okay, get up in the morning, and Jesus says, "Hey guys, my students, okay, my disciples, here's what we're doing today. We're gonna go it's Shabbos today. We're gonna go into a field, and and you're, not me, you're gonna start picking grain, which those pesky rabbis, they say, is a violation of the biblical commandment of Shabbos. You're gonna pick grain. I'm gonna be there with you. We're gonna be out there for a while. We're gonna be picking grain, and then when those pesky rabbis come, I'm gonna give it to them, but I'm not gonna be picking the grain." And now, what's going on here? Let's interpret this for a second, if we may. He's not doing anything wrong per se. Yeah, he's the ringleader, but he's not partaking in a prohibited action. They are, and he's gonna wait for the rabbis to come and give it to him, right? So now here's the thing. Let's stop and reason for a second how this looks. You've got let's say, a religious leader of sorts, who has a group of people that follow him, and he's their leader. And they have a disagreement with another religious group, okay? And he says to them, okay, we're gonna basically go out there and we're gonna pick a fight today. We're gonna pick a fight. But he isn't putting himself in the same situation, in the same position of potential danger as his disciples are in. Meaning he's saying, I'm gonna be scot-free here, and you guys are in danger. But I just want to make a point to these rabbis. Listen, let's imagine a different version of how it would have turned out. Let's say the rabbis did warn them twice. You know who would have been liable for the death penalty at that point in time? The disciples, not him. He could have gotten off scot-free, lived, and they would have been in danger of being put to death for what they did. Now, if you ask me, I know this is not very favorable interpretation of Jesus to Christians. I think it's one they haven't considered before. Maybe they have, as a sort of cult leader or a religious leader of sorts of a small group of people, which is why I say a cult and not a religion, who is teaching all kinds of radical and extreme ideas. By the way, some of his ideas are not radical and extreme, and I think some of them are even okay, but that's a different video. which I may make at some point in time, God willing. But he's teaching them all kinds of revolutionary ideas, let's say, and extremist ideas, and he's pushing back hard against the Pharisees, the rabbis, and he's saying, let's test the response. And by the way, if you get caught, you're dead, and I'm not. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a very compassionate leader, a leader who's willing to suffer with the people that he's leading. If he was a different kind of leader, he would have gone with them and done it himself to show, look, I'm also in danger here, but it's just you. Anyway, that is a quite different view of Jesus that Christians are not accustomed to. Jews tend to, I think, look at him more as that kind of a person. It's less favorable, but we're not bound to a favorable view of Jesus. There's nothing personal. He said certain things that I think are okay, which again I said are beyond the scope of this video. But a lot of the things he said were not okay, and it's according to Jewish law, and even just Jewish thinking, and it's not personal. It's just, if anyone would have said those things, we would have looked at him like, oh, okay, it doesn't sound so right. Anyway, I'm going to end with that. A happy 4th day of Hanukkah. The 5th day starts tonight. Enjoy your 5th candle, enjoy your sufganiyot, enjoy your latkes, and have a great, great Hanukkah.